Perfect. Yeah. So just a little bit about BMR. I mean, we work mainly with workplaces, some schools and universities. And what we really do in terms of doing workplace wellbeing is we look to remove the fluffiness around workplace wellbeing and really focus on using a really systematic and data-driven approach. And what that is basically kind of getting underneath the workplace factors that cause the stress in the first instance, rather than throwing fruit bowls, yoga, exercise classes, meditation. All of those things are very focused on the individual and not really on the environment which is causing the stress in the first place. This is why I'm really, really excited about ISO 45003, because that's, you know, it's not mandating, but it's giving this best practice guidance framework of how we should be doing workplace mental health. So, you know, we're looking at it really from a psychological health and safety perspective, and pulling in this kind of well-being management system around that. So what we're going to cover today are the statutory legal requirements for workplace mental health in the UK. And a lot of the time, organisations simply are not aware that there is a legal requirement to do workplace mental health in a specific way. So we're going to have a look at that. We're going to have a look at the consequences for businesses that have failed to meet those requirements in the past. So we're going to have a little bit of a look at some case law around that. And then we're going to look at, you know, kind of what's the size of the current problem with workplace mental health at the moment and the impact of COVID-19. Look at what an integrated approach is to workplace wellbeing, and then ISO, how we manage psychosocial risk. What is that? What are the hazards? And actually, in terms of well-being, how can we measure that we're actually getting, we're getting some impact and getting a return in investment in terms of what we're doing? I prefer these in sessions to be as interactive as possible. So if you've got any questions as we go through, or you want to make any comments, feel free to unmute yourself and just jump in. Otherwise it can be a bit boring with me just talking at you with slides. I know how that feels. So by all means, just hopping in with different perspectives, that's absolutely fine. And just make it a little bit more engaging. Morning, Kevin. Okay, so what we're going to start with is the UK Health and Safety Legal Framework. So what we've got in law, there's two stages of law, which is the Act, which is what you have to do, and then the regulations, which is how you need to do it, okay? So Health and Safety at Work Act does cover psychological welfare, psychiatric injury, stress management. All of that is covered in this section 2, that for as far as a duty of care for employees, the employer has to ensure the health, safety and welfare, okay, of all employees. And that welfare is the piece, okay, that takes care of stress, psychological hazards and all the rest of it. What we're really good at in this country is looking at the safety aspect. So if there's a missing guardrail, if it's manual handling, if it's going to cause us a physical injury, if we're going to drop something on our foot, we're really good at putting procedures and processes in place for that. We skip the welfare bit because there's never really been a large enforcement of that. We know the big penalties in construction and places like that where the scaffolding, safety has to be key, but so does psychological welfare. And I think as we've progressed with time, that is becoming more and more relevant. The more equipment we've got, the more technology that we've got. We don't have regular 9-to-5 jobs anymore like we used to have, and the 4 weeks holidays and you go away and no one can get hold of you because of, we've now got that technology where there's no off time. So our stress levels are far different. So we really need to be looking at this welfare piece. And, I'm very keen to push on more enforcement of that because we have this duty to do it and we're not doing it. The way that we need to do that in terms of the welfare of the employees is exactly the same way that we do it in regards to safety. We need to carry out risk assessments, okay? It's that simple. It is a risk-based approach. So we have the procedures in place, we have the processes in place within business, because we have health and safety procedures, and we will have a assessments. But we're not necessarily doing that for everybody, for welfare. Hi, Teresa.
Hi.
Hi. I'm just going to let somebody else in. So as far as the law is concerned, there is a clear, it's very clear on what we need to do. So that's just the Health and Safety at Work Act. There is also the Equality Act that covers workplace mental health. And there's also other acts such as the Protection from Harassment Act. Okay. So then we've got these best practice guides as well. And that's things like the UK Health and Safety Executive Stress Management Standards. And if you look at those stress management standards, that will give you advice and guidance on kind of 6 key areas of psychological risk. It's showing you how to be compliant. It's only guidance, it's not the law, it's just saying this is a good way to do it. And then we get even more granular detail in terms of guidance with the new ISO standard that's coming in. So I don't know, just kind of maybe in the chat or in a show of like just a hello, or unmuting yourself. Who here as an organisation already has ISO 45001 as a standard within the business? Anybody?
No.
Drop me a note in the chat.
No.
No? No? No. No, so pretty much nobody has 45001. 45001 is an occupational health standard. Okay, so a lot of you will probably have 9001 or some environmental ones. What these standards do is they just set out a framework and with real detail on how is the best practice in terms of executing something like occupational health or psychological health. And I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail when we get onto the standard. But if we want to look at it's just sticking with the legal framework for now, if we look at case law, some of this case law that exists, okay, around this subject matter goes back really, really far. There are actually, I think, cases I was reading yesterday back to 1938 about having this responsibility to look after people. But if you look at this one here, which is more recent, Walker versus Northumberland County Council in 1995 was a case law that set the precedent around psychological health, okay? That it was the employer's duty to provide a safe system of work that extended to psychiatric illness as well. Now, he was a social worker. He had a very heavy and emotional, demanding caseload, yeah? And he had a mental breakdown. And then when he would come back to work, he kept asking for assistance, kept asking for help, but he got no additional support and he suffered another breakdown in the following year. And then he was dismissed due to ill health, and he brought an action against his employer for breaching their duty of care to take steps to ensure he had a manageable workload. And that was upheld. Okay, so that set the precedent that they did have this duty of care. And then we've got other case law here that, you know, Barber v Somerset, that sets out 16 principles if you want to, I'll send you the links to these case laws if you want to read them. But there was 16 other principles that were set out there. The main one is that the employer must be in breach, the employee must be able to prove the injury caused by the breach, and that it was reasonably foreseeable on the part of the employer. So if you look at Walker v Northumberland, the first time he went off ill, that wasn't foreseeable. The employer possibly didn't see that coming. But the second time, that's reasonably foreseeable that if he was ill once and you've done nothing to change his environment, he's going to be ill again. Okay, so there's the case law that's kind of set that. And then you've got further case law that set the precedence of statutory duty with vicarious liability in Majowski versus St Thomas's NHS Trust. And Majowski claimed that he'd been bullied by his manager, okay, and the employer was held vicariously liable under Section 3 of the Protection from Harassment Act, okay. So he was awarded there. And the same with Helen Green versus Deutsche Bank. Yeah, under the same kind of case law, the same precedents, she was awarded £800,000 under the Protection from Harassment Act, okay, and a further £35,000 for psychiatric injuries. So, you know, the penalties can be really, really high. What we find a lot of the time is they don't get to this far. You know, there are a lot of settlement agreements and that type of thing that exist around stress or people being off for long periods of time. But all of this costs organisations money, okay? And when we're looking at what that does cost us in terms of employers, these figures here are pre-COVID, and these figures here are relatively conservative. So if we look at the cost of mental ill health in the UK, that's estimated to be around £45 billion. So some of them are real tangible costs that we can work out, which is things like absence costs and turnover costs. But the other cost that's a little bit more difficult, and if you actually look at the Deloitte report that you can find on Google, or I can send you a copy, the Deloitte Workplace report shows you how they've calculated the presenteeism costs. But that's where, you know, we've all had those days where we rock up to work and we just have a I can't be bothered day. So we're there, but we're not actually productive. That's reportedly costing businesses up to 30 billion. I've spoken to other people within the industry, they reckon that could be about double that, okay? And it typically averages out around about £1,700 per employee per year, okay? And that's standard across private and public sector. If you're looking at financial services and banking, you can double that, according to Deloitte. So there is a real tangible cost here, okay? But conversely, there's also a real tangible return on investment when you invest in well executed well-being programs in the workplace. So yes, it costs us a lot of money, but it's not going to cost us a lot to put it right. We just need to do it in the right way. And you know, I've put a figure in there about suicide, which is not related to money, but you know, kind of morally and societally, 3,000 deaths a day by suicide. Okay, one person every 2 minutes. You know, if you look at the COVID figures last year, does anybody here know exactly what the final death by COVID was for 2020? I think it was like 1.2 million, was it? Not sure if anybody knows for sure. What that right? Roughly, but I think it was about 1.2, 1.3 million by the time we got to the end of December. Let's pop that in the chat. No, that was globally, Sarah. So globally 1.2, 1.3 million COVID deaths. But globally, yeah, there was over 1 million deaths by suicide in that same period. So, you know, we talk about COVID being a pandemic, you know, suicide is a real issue, okay? And in the UK, if we look at the UK figure, that's 18 people per day. 75% men and 25% women. UK is about 6,000 to 7,000. There's no current figures for suicide in the UK. The last ones are about 2019, 2018. But the numbers are way, way, way too high, okay? And the scary thing is that the number in young people is increasing. So, you know, it's not good news. So we get the employers and, you know, there's some employers that say, well, you know, people shouldn't be bringing work, you know, stress and home stuff into work, you know, it's a place of work. It's a place where people come, okay? So we've got a duty of care and a responsibility as employers to make sure that we are actually providing support in these areas. Now, if you don't mind just unmuting on your phones, who has workplace wellbeing stuff in place in your current work environment, and just tell me what that entails, what you've got in there?
We've got here at CAE, we have got a bit of a coordination with HR, run the health and well-being, obviously a few programs, but obviously it started, I think, late 2019, like a real move on it, but obviously due to the pandemic, everything has tailed off a little bit. And obviously, we also highlighted the fact that obviously, as you mentioned, the pandemic itself has got obviously the indirect effect on mental health for people working from home, people, the uncertainties within the system. So that has also sort of pushed the company to start looking at those who are working from home, who are not always on site, how to check on them. So we do like a regular sort of catch-ups with them, sometimes just a general catch-up to see if we can pick out the things that they wouldn't talk about when they are under work situation. So HR is doing quite well. I help with that as a health and safety manager. I help with that because there's a lot of, obviously, the demography is quite wide, so we have to make sure that we catch up with everybody. So it's going. It's not the best, don't get me wrong, and I'm looking forward to the standard. But
and that's good because it's unusual for me to get too many health and safety managers on here that have actually got a direct involvement. It tends to sit in the remit of HR.
Yeah, no, I over here I try to make sure that we get in because we've got quite a few number of employees, and if you're not careful, things are gonna get out of hand before we can notice it. Right.
Anybody else?
I'm actually a counsellor, and I think those numbers are skewed because a lot of the times they don't put suicide on the death figures.
Absolutely.
So they're vastly underrated.
Absolutely, Sarah, you're absolutely right. Because
what is freaking out from a counsellor's point of view is that you're not getting people making phone calls. Everyone's going, oh, people are phoning more because of mental health issues at home at the moment in the COVID, but they're not because they can't get a safe and quiet place to actually make the phone call because there's kids around, they're homeschooling, there's all sorts of, so they're not actually making those phone calls. So however much you think those phone calls have gone up to the mental health profession, they haven't gone up anywhere near as much as they need to be able to facilitate or solve the problems.
Absolutely. Does anybody else want to add anything in before I move on to the next slides?
I'm a coach in a KIC that I set up, so I'm continually dealing with people that are struggling at work, and I think one of what we discussed in terms of presenteeism, because I've read the Deloitte documents, and what bothers me is that I think what it doesn't take into account is when people are presenting themselves to work but they're under pressure with mental health issues, is that does impact upon injury. And I know cases where people have, driven trucks into people because they're so tired and they're so down. And how do they measure that? I mean, I don't know how companies I don't even think they measure the impact of mental health that leads into an health and safety issue, an actual physical injury. And I think, I think the problem's huge, but so many things are not being measured. That's
absolutely. And it's not measured, I think, because people don't know how to measure it. And I'll come on to how you can do that, because it's not difficult with the right kind of approach and the right tools. And we're not reinventing the wheel here. We're doing what we've already got.
Absolutely. I mean, I come from an education background. I taught the artists to reach the kids that got kicked out of school and that. But what I saw in the 10 years I was in education was the destruction of the staff because of the regime.
They're very poorly supported. Yeah. Yeah, and I think, we've got a much bigger problem here in so much as, the government's busy dealing with the pandemic, but, there is this next wave where in terms of educating the children through and everything else, it needs to be part and parcel of society, and that's all this breaking down the stigma. And we're getting there. Things take time. It's progress step by step. The positive news is that it is moving in the right direction. So that's really good. Okay, thanks for that, Kevin. So how workplace health how workplace mental health is often done is with mental health first aiders, employee assistance programs, fruit bowls and yoga, exercise, nutrition, meditation, mindfulness, okay? All really valid parts of a well-being strategy, but that is nowhere near enough. It's just not enough, okay? It's a start, but mental health first aid, EAP, is very focused on these are all very focused on the individual. There is no onus here on the organisation to do anything about the stresses that are causing the workplace the factors that are causing the stress in the workplace in the first instance, okay? So it's very person orientated and not organisation orientated, okay? So when we're looking at an integrated model of workplace mental health, and that little picture shouldn't come up at the bottom, we're looking at, and this is the essence of 45003, the new standard, okay? We're looking at a workplace that promotes well-being, yeah, so promotes psychological well-being, but then actively works to prevent harm, okay? Now that's from the National Standard of Canada, but you will find that, you know, the scope of the ISO standard will say that says the same thing. Okay, so I don't know how many of you on here have done any mental health training, but essentially we all exist on a continuum, yeah, of mental health. Like we do physical health. Some days we'll be well, other days we'll be like flying because we've trained for a marathon. We might have a cold, and then we might get diagnosed with a more serious condition, cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. The same exists exactly for mental wellness. So we might be flourishing, we might be firing on all cylinders, really on top of our game, a really optimal state of well-being. We then sometimes in life are just in a state of where we're happy and we're going along and we're mentally well. And then we might have bereavement, we might have COVID, divorce, separation, something that's going to throw us off track out of this area of mental wellness, give us some level of stress, but we're not ill. We're just not, firing on all cylinders as we normally would be. And then we'll have diagnosable mental illness. Now, your workforce will exist everywhere across that spectrum. So you've got to do workplace strategies that meet people along that spectrum in all areas. So, you know, at the moment, you know, going back to the fruit bowls and the yoga and the meditation, those are generally aimed at people that are flourishing, that are mentally well, because all of those things, if you're really, really stressed and somebody goes, yeah, here's yoga, I know what I'd say, yeah? And I wouldn't be going to yoga, okay? So those activities are great in terms of the promote flourishing bit. The people that are already engaged, the people that are already switched on to looking after themselves will love that. And that's something that gives them more in terms of promoting flourishing. But if I'm languishing, if I've got a mental illness, I don't want yoga. I maybe need some other support. I might need an extra pair of hands to help me with the mountain of work that I feel like I'm drowning in. I might need somebody to take the pressure off until the funeral's over. So I need to be able to speak up and say, I'm not coping very well. Can I just offload a little bit of work to somebody else until I'm back on my game again? And we need to be able to have programs in place that support and destigmatize being able to say, I'm not okay today. Okay. And that's all it is. It's about being human. Yeah. It's about taking the piece of humanity, the human being that we leave sometimes at the front door when we walk into work and we put our work hats on. It's like, why did you leave the person at the door when you did that? So in the UK, as you can see from this diagram, you know, we do a lot that's focused around mitigating illness. We do a little bit that's around promoting flourishing. But what are we doing in the preventing harm space? Yeah, we're not doing an awful lot, okay? So again, just to kind of drop in the chat, who here has an organisation that performs psychological risk, works for an organisation that performs risk assessments on stress factors on a regular basis? No? Anybody?
Obviously, we have risk assessment for that, but not something that is constantly being looked at. Obviously, it sort of falls in between HR and health and safety. So it's a bit of something that we haven't sort of honed in here.
Yeah, so it's quite reactive. It's as and when you need it. So we've got COVID, let's do a risk assessment. We've got, you know, we'll maybe do a risk assessment. I think a lot of organisations take that approach if they're doing these risk assessments at all. When people present with, what's WRS, Teresa? Oh,
work-related stress.
Just tweaked, work-related stress.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're part of occupational health. I run the counselling, staff support and mediation team at St George's. So we've had an in-house support service for the last 20 years as part of occupational health. So we're very lucky to be able to have that really established relationship with occupational health, and anyone who presents with work-related stress comes to see us, and we see about 300 people a week in groups or in individuals. And in terms of the stigma, that's been the only good thing that's come out of COVID, is that we contacted everybody that we had seen who worked in the COVID area in the first surge to ask them how they were at the beginning of the second surge, and asked them to tell 2 people they worked with, if they felt comfortable, about the help they'd had from us. And they all said they'd already done that. And I thought, this is great in terms of creating a culture where it's okay to not be okay, as you were just saying. Absolutely. That people are actually saying, we're all struggling and that's normal, and letting other people know about the service and coming to see us. So we've had a doubling in referrals this year so far. Yeah. We've seen 133 members of staff individually, and we're running 28 groups a week. Wow. For our staff in the critical care areas, the COVID areas, and the stress areas. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. No, thanks for that. That's really, really good input. Thank you. What I'm finding generally in organisations, and there are exceptions like with the NHS, is that, and again with the NHS, Teresa, am I right in saying it's very different from trust to trust, isn't it? So
most are now farmed out to EAPs, and people don't use them because they don't have a relationship with them. In London, there's a group of about four trusts that have in-house service, and now there's a big push to get more. There's 1.3 million for our group in Southwest London for mental wellbeing, because we recognise that we've got to do it to retain staff.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so just moving on, what we're looking to do with the drive and again with the ISO and everything else that's coming along now, is to kind of step away from this reactive approach and go to an alternative approach of fixing the system of work and not the people. Okay, so for example, what I mean by that is, we would not tell somebody that's joining the warehouse, say in the distribution centre at Tesco's, we wouldn't say to him, "Oh, you look a little bit on the weak side there," or male or female. Here's a gym membership, go to the gym and build your muscles up because you have to lift heavy boxes. We wouldn't do that. We've got guidance, we have rules in place so that we ensure safe working practices and we prevent injuries. So manual handling, box limit, weight limits on boxes, etc. So why do we train people to be more resilient to stress when we could just remove the factors that are causing the stress in the first place? So it's looking at, different approaches around the work environment, How many people does that resonate with? Let's have a meeting to discuss the things we need to do instead of actually doing them. When we've done these assessments and we do the risk assessments and we put our mental wellbeing management plans together for organisations, very rarely is there an action on there that says we want more gym passes, fruit bowls and yoga. It is generally, can we have can we please change the system in the way of work from doing it this way to doing it that way? That would bring us more efficiencies. Can we stop going to so many meetings? Can we look at staggered shifts? So, and this all comes, all this feedback comes from the employees. So what we're saying is, look, people want to be heard. People want to be listened to. So empower your people to organise work in a way that's the most effective and most efficient for them, because one, you'll get more productivity, and two, your people will be happier and a lot more engaged. So, ISO, psychological health and safety at work, managing psychosocial risks. So what is the scope of that? Well, first of all, ISO is a child standard of 45001, and to work to the ISO standard, to actually follow these kind of what's now going to be the global language around workplace mental health, technically, to get the audited certificate, you need to have a 45001 certification. However, there is nothing to stop you just adopting that framework as best practice within your organisation. Okay, it's a voluntary standard anyway, and it's agreed best practice across 72 different countries. Okay, and very much about the organisational process. So really is a game changer. Now, if you're on LinkedIn, you'll see different comments about 45003. Some say fantastic, it's been, you know, it's been needed for years, and others will say it's an absolute bag of spaghetti, it's a nightmare, good luck with that. Okay, my opinion is we've got to start somewhere. If we don't start somewhere, where, you know, all we're just going to do is sit around and talk and moan about it. So 45003 is their first international go at putting this framework in place, okay? And it's guidance, it's not prescriptive, it's guidance on what you should be doing and how you should be doing it. You know, apply common sense and adapt it. The standard will adapt over time. It will change over time. It's just a starting point. So going back to what I was saying before on the integrated model of workplace mental health, the scope of it is to prevent work-related injury and ill health and actively promote well-being within an occupational health and safety management system. Paul, I've recorded the event, so I'll be able to send you a link. So that's, don't worry about that one, okay? So yeah, and now what I really like about ISO 45003 is it's shifting the responsibility for it into a health and safety arena rather than purely an HR arena. And that will give it more of a framework and more health and safety driven, therefore risk assessments, therefore compliance with the law, okay? So if we look at the key elements here, you know, if we're looking at workplace mental health, we need this integrated approach. It's not just down to the employer to sort everything out and make everything rosy in the garden for employees. Employees also have a responsibility to look after their own well-being. So yeah, it's down to the employer to do this middle bit of preventing harm, mitigating illness and promoting flourishing. But it's also down to the employee to practice some self-care in terms of what we call PERMA. It's the 5 pillars of good mental health. It's a psychology model, which is basically on looking at positive emotions, engagement, our relationships, our meaningful, our accomplishment. And I think going back to what you were saying, Kev, before about fatigue and sleep. So it's about the individual doing that and the employer doing the workplace stuff, okay? Sorry, I need a drink. My throat's dry, I'm talking too much. So, one sec. Somebody on the chat.
I was just typed up. It's Martin Seligman's work.
It's Martin Seligman, yeah.
It's amazing stuff. It really is.
Yeah.
Can I just chip in, give you a break as well from talking a second?
Knock yourself out, Kev.
Sorry. But I think, you know, if you know Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
yeah,
most people have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And for me, I look at the love and belonging aspect, and I think that's where mental health, that's where all of our mental health, that's the pivot point. So if you don't feel like you belong in the workplace, and this is that humanist approach, if you don't feel like you belong there, and if you're having a tough time at home, you know, you're between a rock and a hard place, aren't you? So, you know, the PERMA model really does, you know, exemplify that whole humanist approach and looking after yourself. And
absolutely. That's part and parcel of kind of what we promote as well. So yeah, you're absolutely right. So, you know, there's that, and then there's the sleep, because we all know sleep really can impact our mental health.
Massively, yeah.
Yeah, or lack of, should I say. So if we're looking at the key elements of ISO, and bear in mind this is a very kind of generic view of what it is, these are kind of some of the key elements that I've kind of picked out for you. So first and foremost, it's an occupational health and safety responsibility. That doesn't mean to say that there's no input from HR. You know, workplace mental health and this strategy cannot be siloed into kind of one function. It's very cross-functional, it's whole organisation responsibility. But if it's being driven by occupational health and safety and quality management, it puts frameworks in there, it gets it on the business agenda, it makes sure that it's in the forefront of senior leadership. and that it's on documented improvement plans, etc., etc. So that's a really good positive that it's on there. It's also, and this is where some of the kind of contention is around how the hell are you going to do that? It considers internal and external factors. So not just the workplace, but what potential stress factors are our employees subject to from an external perspective. So Teresa, the NHS, that's a big one, isn't it? Like, you won't tolerate abuse, and nurses getting, and doctors getting, and receptionists getting abuse from people. In retail, people being challenged across COVID, are your subcontractors and suppliers all working in the same way? And again, it's about recognizing and understanding that we need to address these things as we go along, yeah? And it will shape as we get better at what we do. It has to have leadership and worker consultation and participation. And participation is key. We can consult all till the cows come home, but if no one's participating, we're not really getting very far. As I say, it's devolving this responsibility, because often leaders think A is happening, and workers are like, yeah, we're at Z. This is really what's happening down here. So it needs to be devolved so that the people doing the jobs are empowered to make those changes and to drive that forward in the way that makes, as I said before, makes work more productive and people happier. It needs to be documented, as we do with most quality management standards. So very clear documented policies and very clear responsibilities on who's taking ownership of what. And there needs to be this ongoing engagement. And most importantly, this standard really encompasses meeting the legal requirements. So it's got the risk assessment, it's got the root cause investigation and analysis, putting your improvement plans, resources, and training for all. Okay? Because at the moment, we look at training for mental health. How many of you on this call can say that your employers train every single person in your organisation on mental health? Yeah. How many of you have had to sit and watch a video on which fire extinguishers to use? Because I know I've seen that video a lot of times, yeah? So I'd rather watch a video on how to look after my mental health than how to put out a fire. Because if I see a fire, I'm running. I don't care what colour the fire extinguishers are. I'd grab the nearest one to me, panic, and I'd be off. So, this needs to be education for all. And again, we need to differentiate with awareness for everybody, okay? And that's fine. That helps us to understand a little bit about our thoughts, feelings, and emotions. It's not about equipping us all to be the next psychologist or psychotherapist. It's just giving us a basic understanding of what mental health is and what anxiety feels like if we start to experience that, so we don't think we're having a heart attack. But then you've also got training for line managers. How many people have worked in job roles yourself whereby you're really, really good at your job and you do your job, so you get promoted to a manager, and then all of a sudden you're like, well, I don't know how to manage. So there might be a little bit of management training in there. Absolutely, Paul, differences in people do need to be absolutely valued, because differences in people are what can enable creativity and all sorts of kind of ways to be more productive. So, with the line manager training, as a manager now in a business and as a leader, and I'm not just saying that leaders are just getting this wrong and employers are not doing it right, but, traditionally management was about managing performance. Yes, we would have an element of people management and some leadership skills and how to be great leaders, but where is the training when you're doing your business degrees? Where is the training when you're doing all your management training? Where is the training around managing psychological risk and what your responsibility is as a leader on how to deal with stress and how to signpost people? 8 MHFAers in an organisation of 2,000 people isn't going to cut the mustard at all. So it needs to be a whole organisation approach to training in a way that's really scalable and cost effective.
Can I just interject? What I've found in the last couple of years, because I have been brought in to work with some larger companies, but it's always the captain of the ship that sets the tone. And I think that's the biggest issue. And I know somebody's mentioned this sort of old school stigma about productivity inversely proportional to taking care of employees. Mm-hmm. What I've found with working with larger companies is it is if the person at the top doesn't believe in any of this, hasn't got those core values, you ruin. And here's where the problem lies. And I found this in education, that your middle managers, your senior managers look upwards to see how they should act and behave. And that's the hardest thing to crack. It's the dinosaurs at the top.
Yeah, and it's I delivered some training into a bunch of senior leaders in Deloitte's, all very senior partners in the other week, and and that was very much about role modeling behaviours, because people aren't stupid. If you pay service to it and you're not interested and you're going, yeah, just crack on with it, and you're not interested, they know. So people don't care until they know that you care.
Yeah, it's Bandera's modelling, isn't it? And they do look up, and I think with this ISO 45003, I just think the sooner this can be mandatory, enforced. I know the pressure's coming up now, and it's amazing, but the sooner something gets put in place, then and
it's not going to be enforced. It is going to be a voluntary standard, but what it's going to need is it's going to need somebody. I mean, I'm Sheila at BMO, and I'm shouting as loud as I can, but I'm a very small voice, but fortunately with the likes of LinkedIn and all of these types of things, you can kind of get that voice heard a lot more. But it needs big organisations to adopt this. It needs big organisations to put into their tender agreements that you need to show me that you've got an ISO certificate.
Absolutely.
Because then you're pushing people into doing this, and this has to start. If it doesn't start with leadership commitment, you're absolutely right, Kevin, it's going to die on its backside, because
absolutely.
It won't take off. So it can't have anyone paying lip service to it. It needs to be done, and it needs to be done right. And we're at that point now where I think a lot of senior leaders, I won't use the word dinosaurs, but I just did, but we've kind of got one foot on each side. It's like with technology, there's this generational crossover now, whereby there's a bunch of us from like the 70s and maybe into the 80s that were like, oh, you just tough it up, you put the lid on the box and swallow it down, and you just pull yourself together and you get on with it, yeah? And that's a large percentage of senior leaders, because it's that age bracket, the late 40s, 50s, 60s. And then you've got this new generation that's coming through that's completely different.
Yes.
And it's the same with having one foot in old technology and one foot in new technology. We've got that generational crossover. So give it 10 years' time, we won't be having these types of conversations, because this will be more of the norm.
Absolutely. And this is what we're here for, isn't it? Many small voices will make a big noise.
Absolutely. And, so there needs to be this whole kind of organisation approach, and it needs to be organisation, not people. Not put the onus on people to fix themselves, sort the work environment out that's causing the stress in the first place. Yeah. We've got this meeting of legal requirements, and then we've got this quality management framework. Going back to what somebody was saying before, you can't just do it reactively. These risk assessments, it's got to be an ongoing basis. If this was a shop floor, this was a production line, you'd keep going back, you have your statistical process control, you look at variations, you fix the variations, you apply your lean methodologies, and you apply your Kaizen and all of this stuff, the continuous improvement models. So it's not just educating people just on mental health, but it's about educating them on how this contributes to overall business productivity. So for occupational health, for example, I had a lady on last week, and she was saying, yeah, but I work with a team of occupational health people who don't get how this contributes into the bigger picture. So it's not just teaching about mental health training, it's about looking at the knowledge gaps across the whole organisation and bringing it, this is how it all pulls together to make us all better. Does that make sense? Okay, so in terms of the risk assessments for ISO, looking at the hazards and the circumstances that the workplace puts on us, okay? So what we're looking at here is the typical kind of quality circle: identify, assess, control, and review, okay? So, if I was to say to you, tell me what a psychological hazard is in the workplace, could anybody tell me?
Being bullied.
Yeah, that's one of them.
Sometimes financial incentive can be
so reward and recognition, yeah.
An overwhelming workload.
Absolutely, Mel. We've all had that, haven't we? And you've got the HSE talk about 6 of these hazards in the workplace, but any of these in isolation will either give us a job that we love going to, or give us a job that we hate, that stresses us out. So workload, autonomy and support are the biggest factors that occur most of the time. So high workloads, very little control, and no support doesn't make for a great day at the office. Not having clear roles and responsibilities, so our job spec clear, are we really clear on where one responsibility ends and another one starts? As you say, Kevin, bullying with relationship conflict, change consultation and organisational justice. So these are the workplace factors that we need to be understanding and how they impact our people. And if you look at COVID now, apply that to here, all of that is increased tenfold, because in this, workload was bad enough when we just had work to deal with and then home to come home to, but the two are sat in the same space now, and we don't just have workloads, we might have managing relatives or looking after the, people that can't look after themselves, homeschooling kids, and we don't actually know how to measure what success looks like in this day and age. So all we do is we've got this really critical voice that tells us we're doing everything really bad because we're not managing to keep all the plates spinning. So workload, autonomy, support, all of these things are really, really difficult in the best of times, made worse over the last year with the situation that we've been in. So we really do need to look at working on how we can identify the hazard. And this is where we work with organisations to conduct surveys, okay, that asks different questions that assess the perception of the individual's work experiences, yeah? So what supports the well-being and productivity, or what increases their stress levels. And then from that, this is all done anonymously. From that, we can look at then all of these workload factors that are identified on here, and then go, okay, so in terms of your scores, these are the areas, that we need to be focused on. So cognitive demand scored 8 out of 100, very high at risk. Emotional demand and workload, those 3 all kind of go together. And what it does in each of those elements, we can then look at what's the stuff I'm doing well, i.e. my optimal levels, what's the stuff that's neutral, what's the stuff I really need to look at, okay? And we just focus on the risk areas, because that way we're doing very targeted activities at areas that are really causing people the most amount of stress. And because it's done anonymously, we're not saying, that came out as management support. We're not saying, oh, John, my boss, is a complete ogre. We're just saying management support's an issue. So it's a less of a confrontational discussion. And then what we do is we set up a health and safety wellbeing committee like you would have for physical health and safety. And we review the results and we put a risk management plan together. Okay, but that risk management plan would be Department A, these were the risk factors that came up. We've had a conversation, we've had a meeting about it, or discussions, and these are the areas that we need to focus on improving. We make some improvements, we allocate responsibility, we put an actionable end date on there. We may have a review period in there, and then we check and see whether it's had the desired impact. And we do that by going back and running the survey again, okay, around the work environment, and seeing, did that change from survey 1 to survey 2? What percentage change did we get? Did we go in the right direction and have the right impact? If we did, brilliant. Let's look at the other areas that we can now start to concentrate on. And if we didn't, then we need to review it and we need to go again because we've still got an issue. Okay, and we do that not just on the work design, so we do that for the work environment and the psychological hazards, but we also do that around PERMA as well. So we've got another survey around PERMA that looks at how people are performing on these pillars of good mental health, so meaningfulness, accomplishment, relationships, and we can do stuff around that as well. Okay, and then from that we can then engage the right activities across the whole spectrum of the mental health continuum in terms of how we support this integrated model of workplace mental health, if that makes sense. Okay, so we've got employee surveys, we've got data analytics, we've got risk management tools, and we've got line manager training. So all of this is helping with health and safety obligations. So I'm having to look at the other screen because I haven't got my glasses on and that's too small on the one in front of me. Yeah, so all of this, if used in the way that the platform is designed to be used, is a compliance tool for ISO 45003, okay? What we're doing here is we're making data-driven decisions. We're not just going, I wonder what's going to happen. So we can do work environment surveys. We can look at individual character strengths, and we use the values in actions. Flourish surveys based on the PERMA and wellbeing check-ins. Paul, you're asking how are individual problems and grievances reported and resolved though? So you would have documented policies around that. So if you've got a grievance or an issue that you need to raise against, say, your manager, maybe bullying or harassment, within your ISO documented policies, there would be almost kind of whistleblower processes in there so that you can flag those in without recrimination. So it has to be this whole supportive piece in the way that we document everything up. Okay, does that answer your question?
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got the employer tools, and then going back to what I was saying before about it needing to be an integrated model of workplace mental health, we then give the employees some tools, okay, in terms of they've got an app and access stress reduction exercises, so guided meditations, wellbeing check-ins and daily mood journals, hours of mental health education. So everybody's got education around mental health, and then some digital coaching that just reminds them, listen, have you been thinking about sleep? How are you feeling this week? Just reminds them to kind of check in and do some work on some of the self-care tools that exist within the platform. So it's, but again, none of this works unless it's implemented well, unless it's, you know, owned and driven by leadership, or believed in by leadership, and that people are empowered to get the job done. And I tend to always finish on this slide, which is this statement I hear all the time, which really winds me up. Yeah, and again, Mel, giving people the time to complete their education. And again, the video education pieces that we've got within the platform, no more than 3 minutes long, 5 minutes at max. They're all little bite-sized chunks of video. You can either watch them in your own time, or you do it as part of the program. But yeah, it's not going to cost them much to give you 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour to fill in a questionnaire and do a little bit of learning. So yeah. And this is where organisations need to get to understand this bit, that our people are our greatest assets. Because, you know, I hear it so many times, our people are our greatest assets. No, they're not the way you treat them. If people were an asset, so if you look at, you know, when you look at staff costs on the balance sheet or on the P&L, right? So you get staff costs and it's literally staff costs, I don't know, 500K, 600K, okay? If that staff cost on the profit and loss sheet was broken down that says, okay, staff loss was 600, staff cost was 500K, but 70 or 80 or 100K of that was absence related. And another chunk of that was settlement agreements and payoffs. And another chunk of that was recruitment costs. We would have a very different view at leadership and at senior leadership level on those numbers, because any improvement in any single one of those numbers goes straight to the bottom line. And this is the trick I think that we're missing in terms of communicating with leaders. So there are financial and cultural KPIs, you know, and you look at staff costs within the business, right? And then you look at your maintenance costs on things like facilities and machinery and equipment, etc., company cars. More maintenance and more effort will be put into assets that are visible on the balance sheet than there is put into people. And yet on the balance sheet, when you look at the numbers, your people costs will generally be higher. It's generally one of the biggest costs within the business. So we need, you know, as business leaders, we need to be paying more attention to it because it just makes good business sense. And if we look, you know, some of the KPIs that we track, or that you can track yourselves, you know, through the survey. We can look at cultural KPIs. So we can look at here, and there's three that spring to mind, actually. I need to add the other one in, but one is the intention to quit. You know, if you could quit today, tomorrow, would you be gone? Yeah. So we can look at intention to quit, and we can track that over time to see whether what we're doing is having the desired impact. We also have a burnout risk score to track and monitor burnout risk, again, based on what employees are telling us. The other thing we can look at is barriers to access an EAP. Even if you don't have an EAP, what we're saying there is, if we had an EAP system, would you access it? And if not, why not? Okay, and that tells us about the level of stigma that's existing in the organisation. And then we can look at some of these financial KPIs. So again, just going back to what I was saying before about getting it on the balance sheet so that leaders can see, actually, our absenteeism rate's costing us this much. Our average, you know, employees are spending very little time in the business, and that's because most of the employees are walking after 2 months. Well, you've either got a problem with your recruitment process, or you've just got a toxic culture within your organisation potentially. So, you know, something as simple as an employee-led attrition rate can tell us that, and an employer-led attrition rate can tell us, you know, are we recruiting the wrong people? So there are real ways to measure workplace well-being that, you know, and to do it well without having to skirt around the edges, be so fluffy about it. And, you know, we just need to get into the meats and bones of what's actually really going on within the organisation. So I'm going to stop there. And if anybody wants to ask me any questions, have a chat. If anybody wants to have a quick look at the survey tools that we use, I'm happy to spend another 10 minutes going through that. I appreciate it's 11 o'clock. Or if anyone would just want to pick up with me on a separate call at a later date, I'm also happy to do that as well.
I have got a little question, and it might also be something that may open other aspects of what you've already spoken to us about. One of the biggest issues I've seen over quite a few years in my work as a health and safety professional is where to strike the balance between external pressure or having sort of a psychosocial event happening outside of the workplace and then bringing it into work. I will use an example as somebody, for example, if I take myself and I say, I'm a bit stressed from, let's say, something that happens at home. So that's nothing to do with work. Now, under normal circumstances, because we normally taught that if you're stressed from work, then work will look after you. Or if the stress or if whatever psychosocial aspect is happening to you is work related, and work will look after you. Now, where do we merge the two? Because one, the work one will be foreseeable because we can check the work rates, we can check all that. But the one from home will not be foreseeable. The reason being that, how do we sort of do that? Because I think if somebody's having these issues at home, likelihood is they will not talk about it at work because they don't want it to come in, the confidence to do that.
Absolutely. And this goes back to this reasonably foreseeable. Okay, so let's put that into an example. So say you've got somebody that used to be really on his game, coming into work very efficient, then all of a sudden you see performance dropping off. So that would be one indicator that things aren't quite right. If he's coming in and performing his job and there is no difference, there's no difference in productivity, you're not magic. You're not going to be able to spot that. Okay, and that is, you know, unfortunately, people will slip through the cracks because people are very good at wearing a positive face, okay? But if you see a drop in productivity, they're missing deadlines. You know, this is where we have this culture that we're instilling, where there's an education for all. People can spot signs and symptoms when people are not really quite 100% themselves. Are you okay? Ask it twice, mean it. And then if that person then says, well, actually, no, I'm not, I've got problems going on at home, again, you know, what do we then do with that person? So we open up and we have that conversation. We're not going to sack that person. If they're normally a very good employee, we say, okay, well, I'm sorry, mate, but you need to pull your socks up and just leave it at the front door. We wouldn't do that because actually, if that person works in a safety critical area, or if that person is operating a piece of dangerous plant or equipment, or if they're working on a massive contract that's going to have huge financial implications for the business. You need to take a commercial and a health and safety based decision and go, okay, identify the risk, assess the risk, and control the risk. It goes back to health and safety and risk management all the time.
Yeah. A follow-up question will be exacerbation. So, for example, let's say the person comes in, couldn't say anything or didn't feel comfortable to discuss the impact that he's having outside of work, and then the work situation exacerbates it. How does then that deals with? I'm coming in from the example from the case law Dow versus Intel UK, I think in 2006, whereby the appeal, I think the appeal case said that part of what caused the depression, or her depression, was more part was reasonably foreseeable, but part wasn't, and it was more of exacerbation from work rate. So how do employers or how do managers deal with that?
Yeah, and again, it's like, was the employer aware of that?
A little bit, if you get my point. So the exacerbation aspect of the rate of work was what the employer was aware of. So that was what the employer was.
Yeah, but unless that individual turns around and says, I'm stressed and I'm not coping, I need some support, and then you do nothing about it, then the employer is at risk there. But if the individual says nothing, the employer has an expectation that unless they are told otherwise, somebody is competent and capable to do the job that they were employed to do. They can't be expected to have a magic wand and understand. I think it's about creating this culture. But if that person was working, if I'm understanding you, and then you're giving them, you're not aware that there's an issue at home, and you're giving them maybe more work, and that's exacerbating that situation, you're not reasonably expected to know that if they haven't brought that to you.
So, for example, in a situation whereby the person doesn't say anything about the work rate, they never complain. But obviously, as we all know, there are certain situations whereby the work rate can go up over time. If you don't talk about it, it will just keep piling up. And then you end up getting stressed in that situation. Mm-hmm. Already, the employer will be liable anyway, because they didn't obviously check. The work arrangement wasn't done by whoever is managing that particular person's work. So, inherently, they've already taken the liability, which we are aware of under health and safety. And health and safety law. It's just more of trying to figure out how to get the balance, if you get my point. Because I'm looking at it from a health and safety manager's point of view, looking on it from outside, looking at, let's say, operations manager and his team or her team, and how to balance that to make sure that they are being put in charge, and the sort of health and safety management is helping them or enabling the environment for people to be able to talk about it, and also for management to ensure that they see it at an early stage to help the person who will be in that situation.
Yeah, it's different. As long as the employer has done everything that they can, the employee has a responsibility to speak up as well. The employee needs to be speaking up there. If you are suspect maybe that employee is struggling, or you are putting more work on them when the work rate has already dropped, then maybe you should be doing some sort of risk analysis or having some sort of performance management conversation that's documented around that, because that then might highlight the problem. And this is about having good managers, about being able to train managers as well in the psychological hazards, and being able to spot as leaders and understand what their responsibilities are. But as an employee, if the employee doesn't confide in you, you're a bit of a sticky wicket. And if you go back to one of the case studies that I showed you earlier, there are 16 principles set out by Lord Justice Hale. It'd be worth you having a read through those. I'm no lawyer, and I'm not an org psych, but it would be worth you having a read through those 16 principles. I can send you the link
that'll be good, yeah,
after today, and go through that. Yeah.
All right. No, thank you very much for that. And for the promotion, apologies for taking a bit more time. For the promotion of obviously mental well-being at work, I think some courses are level 6 some degrees and in health and safety, is already doing that. I think it's more of management training systems that haven't incorporated that in yet. So it's there. I think postgraduate and graduate level.
Yeah. It's funny, isn't it? Because it's there for health and safety, but most organisations don't put psychological well-being in health and safety.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's quite a difficult balance. Yeah, but it's there. It's just, I think a bit more promotion is needed through the ranks to push it up. Yeah.
I mean, the good news is that it is moving in the right direction. It's going to take more time and it needs a bigger push. So.
All right. Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you.
You're welcome. So, Paul, you're saying, can the audits pick up on problems within teams and colleagues as performance drop off? Is it one? These audits, yeah, I mean, the assessments can pick up on generic problems. It wouldn't pick up on the specific problem until you're actually having those discussions. And this is the thing, you know, if you're kind of going, it depends on your culture in your organisation as well. So if you've got a really toxic culture, you're going to have to work harder to kind of make those shifts in trust and behaviour. But certainly the risk assessments would pick up on areas that needed focus. And then the way that you're supposed to, you know, the way that we would expect you to structure it is that the results of the survey are discussed in a workshop with the people that contributed to the survey, or a large proportion of the people that contributed to the survey, so we can then start to get issues put on the table.
Yeah, because you'd hope it would pick up problems within areas or teams, not just individuals, because a problem within a team has a far bigger impact potentially than just one individual.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, when we work with organisations, we look at kind of how is your business structured? What are the teams? How do you want to understand the data that's coming back to you? So we can put all the D&I stuff in there. We can put the different teams, the different branches, because, you know, if you surveyed, say we work with a fitness organisation and they've got 96 gyms across the UK. Now, if I just surveyed them in one lump, that's not going to give me a really big detailed view of what's going on in each area. Whereas if you survey each area as a separate department or region or whatever, you can start to get into the nuts and bolts of what, you know, and one organisation or one team or one department might do relationship support and management really well, and another one might do it terribly.